Okay, my name is Ron Carrico. I'm a docent with the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and today we are interviewing Jack
MACHUN.
And he is a command pilot, retired from the United States Air Force, spent 29 years in the United States Air Force, and flew a vast number of fighter airplanes. And what we're going to talk about is his experiences and kind of going along the idea of what do these things fly like, and kind of a comparison between them all. So Jack, where are you from?
Well, originally from Pennsylvania.
Okay, where were you born?
Pardon?
Where were you born?
In Duryea, Pennsylvania, which is north of Wilkes-Barre, and I lived in Ashley, which is just south of Wilkes-Barre.
What did your parents do?
Well, my father was a coal miner. He was born in Poland, and he came over during the big immigration, early 1900s. And he worked in the coal mines until he accumulated enough money to open up a bar. So a good part of my life was living above the bar.
So when did you graduate from high school?
1947.
And how did you decide to go in the Air Force?
Well, when I finished college, that was the end of my draft deferment. So I always called myself a draft dodger because I dodged a draft by joining the Air Force.
So what was did you go to officer training school?
No, I was an aviation cadet.
Oh, that's right, yeah. And so where did you go for that training?
That was at Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas.
San Angelo, Texas?
San Angelo, yeah.
Oh, yeah. My pilot training was at Del Rio, and we used to shoot approaches at San Angelo. And the airplanes you flew in?
Well, in pilot training, I flew the T6.
Okay.
They started us out in T6s instead of starting us out in a light plane and then moving us up. I think the theory at the time was to get rid of the weak ones early, because T6 is a pretty big airplane for somebody that's never flown an airplane.
Right. How long was pilot training in those days?
Well, it was one year. Now, the first 6 months was, they called it basic,
right,
and the next 6 months was called advanced.
So you started off in the T6. What was your advanced trainer?
Well, it was supposed to be in the B-25, but then they decided they needed more jet pilots than they needed multi-engine pilots. So I continued the whole second 6 months in the T6. Now, the reason for that was the T-28, I think it was called, it got grounded because it was throwing props. And so instead of going into the T-28, I stayed in the T6 for the whole year.
Well, the T-28 would have been a step down from the T6, wouldn't it?
No, it was a bigger airplane, actually.
Really? No. Okay. So now you get out of pilot training, and how did you, what airplane did you get out of?
Well, then after pilot training, I went to Moody Air Force Base for jet transition.
And what did you fly there?
And the T-33 was the initial thing. And once you soloed in the T-33, you moved into the F-80. Now, an interesting thing about the F-80 was the early ones didn't have fuel control. And so you control the fuel strictly with the throttle. So you had to be very careful moving your throttle, otherwise you could flame it out and overtemp or whatever.
So when you went from the T-33 to the was it still called the P-80, or did you call it the F-80?
It was called the F-80 when I don't recall it being called a P-80 when I was there. The early ones were P-80, I guess.
So the T-33 must have been a pretty new airplane at the time. It must have been almost brand new.
Well, pretty much, yeah.
And the first of the F-80s, when did they start flying those? 47, 48 probably.
About 47. I remember seeing an F-80. I was to an Army Penn State football game, and an F-80 circled, and this was in 1947.
So you actually graduated from pilot training when?
Pardon?
When did you graduate from pilot training?
March of 52. I was in 52 Baker. That's the second graduating class of 52.
Okay, so, and then where was your initial assignment then?
Well, then after jet transition at Moody Air Force Base, I went to Tyndall Air Force Base for transitioning into F-94B. The F-94B was a all-weather interceptor. It was the very first Air Force airplane or military airplane with an afterburner. And of course, when you have first with anything, you do have problems. But an interesting thing, when I was in pilot school, and I was an aviation cadet, in the mess hall, they call it mess hall at the time, not dining hall, there was a group of navigator cadets that were up for some kind of specialized training. And we were in the chow line at the same time, and this navigator trainee cadet asked me what I was going to do when I graduated. I told him, well, I'm going to go into the F-94B. And he sort of turned ashen because he was told that only the most experienced pilots would be flying the F-94B. And here's this cadet that's going to be good flying 94B. Actually, there was when the 94B first came out, there was a newspaper, not a magazine article about it, and in that magazine article, it said only the most experienced pilots would be flying it. And that was me.
So what was it? So if you would compare to the F-80 to the F-94, what would be the difference?
Well, the F-94 had an afterburner.
Okay.
And it had...
Was it the same engine, just with an afterburner?
It had the same engine with an afterburner. And the nose of the aircraft was extended because there was a radome there for all-weather fighters. And it had a radar observer in the back cockpit. There was no controls stick or anything in the back cockpit other than the radar equipment.
So then so you were stationed at Tyndall with that airplane?
That was my training in
Right.
F-94B was at Tyndall.
But that wasn't an air defense base. It was, where did you go for your defense or your base?
It was a air training command base, I believe, at that time.
So what, it was about 6 months worth of training in the F-94?
Just about, yeah.
Anything unusual ever happened in flying the F-94?
Not really. Let me regress a little bit. At Moody in jet transition, they had a very bizarre way of thinking. They actually, if there was a thunderstorm in the area, they would have us go up and penetrate thunderstorms.
Oh, good.
That was part of the training. Well, of course, nowadays they say just to stay away from a thunderstorm. And the other thing is
Did you ever do that? Did you ever penetrate?
Yeah.
And
Boy,
fill us in a little bit. What altitude and how fast and all that?
well, they would assign us altitudes with 5,000 foot separation because you could drop that
Sure.
much, and you just pick your altitude and fly through it, and it was a dumb thing.
What was your worst experience doing that?
Well, I only did that one time because they didn't have thunderstorms. So it was just one of those things that, hey, we have a thunderstorm, let's go use it. Now, the other thing is, at Moody, they had a weird idea of how you should make a jet penetration. They had the idea that you should go from a high altitude where your fuel consumption is less down to low altitude as rapidly as you possibly can. So they came up with the idea of you put your gear and flaps down and come down at idle, and you essentially were in an unusual position coming down, and then about 3,000 feet before you're supposed to level off, you start cleaning up all this stuff. It was a dangerous maneuver. Now, when we moved down to Tyndall, they didn't do that. They had just a speedboards and not quite idle, and a more gradual descent. But actually, at Moody, you were going down like this.
Well, let's talk about the on takeoff. Or you take off in an F-94. What climb speed did you use to climb to altitude?
Probably around 300.
Okay, and then what was it? They did have a Mach meter at that time. So what kind of Mach would you use in cruise?
Well, the T-33, the F-80, T-33, and F-94B had exactly the same wings and tail assembly. So they were all restricted by a certain Mach, and I think the F-80 and the 94, the Mach restriction was somewhere around 0.8 or so.
Okay. What's the fastest you ever went in one of those airplanes?
Probably at the maximum allowable.
Okay, so now when you train in air defense, we're talking about the very early ages when 52, 53 were anticipating massive Russian bombers coming to the United States, I presume.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the typical training mission that you would do in the F-94?
Well, what they would do is they would launch aircraft to be targets. They would go out away from the base and then head back in, and then we would scramble up and intercept them and supposedly shoot them down.
So you had radar vectoring to get you to the target, and your backseater was trying to lock on with the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And then what kind of missiles did you have?
Well, the F-94B didn't have missiles, it had machine guns.
Really?
Yeah, so the radar observer would position you back behind the target, and then you shot the machine guns.
Who was talking on the radio when they were talking to the control center?
A ground controller.
But I mean, who in your airplane? You or the backseater?
Well, we would communicate together.
But on the radio?
On the radio, no, we would share that. Mainly, the pilot would do it mainly.
Okay, so if you're going out and you're 350 knots or whatever outbound, and you got a bogey coming in doing 250, 300 knots, what was the typical way of attacking? How did you get back at it?
Well, that would be the ground controller would position you back there.
How about how did you get there? Did you dive down below and come to
No,
no,
it just, you get up to the same altitude or higher, and that would position you behind.
What was the typical target you had?
Well, the training targets were typically either another T-33 or a T-33, or they even had F-51s at that base that they would use as a target. And then if there was coordination with SAC, the B-29s would be the target.
You couldn't see the radar, right? You could not see the radar.
No, I had a little scope that when the radar observer locked on, I'd have a sort of a sight glass there,
Okay.
to put the pipper in the right place. And
Were the propeller airplanes bigger targets on the screen than the jets?
oh yes,
So you could see like an F-51 easier than a T-33?
oh yes, quite a bit.
Interesting.
And a B-29, really big.
Yeah. Well, so then how long did you fly the F-90, or where did you fly the F-94?
Well then, after I finished my training at Tyndall Air Force Base, I moved to Itazuki, Japan. And that's where that was my first operational base.
Okay, so you got to Itazuki when?
Oh, probably September of '52, maybe.
So when did the Korean War actually unwind? Do you remember? I don't remember.
But I think around 54, maybe 53 or 54. It was just after President Eisenhower, because he came in, I think, maybe 6 months or so after he was inaugurated, the war ended.
So you were there doing air defense for Japan out of Itazuki.
Mm-hmm.
When you flew, did you fly in single ship or two ship formations, or?
Usually single ship, because in air defense we were all weather. So if you're in weather, you don't want to have another aircraft with you, unless you were close formation.
Did you have any actual contacts with North Vietnamese? I mean,
Not really, no.
were there any scrambles that you went on that were?
So we had Russian aircraft that would be coming in, and we'd go and take a close look at them.
You mean they were flying towards Japan?
Well, they were just doing their reconnaissance, like they still do, I think.
Yeah. So what airplanes did you see? Russian airplanes?
Oh, that 4-engine prop.
The Big Bear
Yeah,
with the counter-rotating turboprops, I think.
yeah.
So what did you do? Take pictures of them and wave and?
No, we didn't. We just stayed away from them so that we didn't interfere with them and don't get shot down.
Okay, so now you're coming. The war's wrapping up, and you're going to change airplanes. What did you go to next?
Well, okay, then after about a year and a half at Itazuki, we transitioned into the F-86D, which was a single engine, single cockpit. The pilot was a radar observer also. And
Where did you train for that?
Pardon?
Where did you train?
The what?
Where was your training? The training for the F-86D.
Right there at Itazuki.
And there was no burner on the F-86, was there?
Oh yes, the F-86D, it was the same as the other F-86 models. The wings were the same, the tail was the same, but the fuselage was bigger and it had a afterburner.
So, as you were transitioning from the F-94 to the F-86, there must have been a lot of talk at the bar that night about, gee whiz, what a difference in airplanes. I mean, it must have been a huge upgrade.
It was quite a bit different. Your landing, your angle of attack on landing was quite high. And you know, the 94 you'd land about like so, and the F-86 like so.
What would be a typical landing speed for the 94?
For the final approach speed for the 94 was around 110, I believe.
And the F-86?
It was maybe 120. That's a long time ago, so don't quote me.
Okay, sure. Well, it depends on fuel too, right? So.
Yeah, well, not really.
Really?
There was enough slop in it to.
So the F-86, of course, it's a lot hotter airplane. I mean, you can get close to Mach 1 on an F-86, correct?
Well, you could go supersonic on.
Well, you could.
If you put it in a dive, you can go supersonic.
And did you actually train for that? I mean, did you actually go out and go supersonic?
Oh yeah, we did that. Yeah.
What was the fastest you ever went? Do you know?
Just 1.1 maybe
Okay.
in a dive.
Right. Now, now you're doing the same idea though. It's just air defense.
It was air defense, yes.
You're talking to the controller. Did you wear a G-suit?
Pardon?
Did you wear a G-suit?
No, because that wasn't. We didn't do that kind of stuff because the F-86D only had I think 24 rockets maybe. Michael, was it 24 rockets?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were mounted in the belly, and then when the rockets would fire, they would drop down and fire.
So they were ballistic? They were just ballistic rockets?
just ballistic rockets.
Oh, wow.
I didn't think the F-86D was a very good airplane for what it was supposed to do.
Did you ever fire the rockets?
Oh, yeah, we
Did you ever hit anything?
well, I shot down no, I did that with the 102. We would shoot at targets. Now, the F-86D, its way of intercepting and shooting at a target was 90 degrees. Instead of getting behind whatever, it was designed to, its maximum was 90 degrees. And it was pretty close. In other words, when the rockets fired, you just passed slightly behind and a little slightly higher than the target.
Was the target a dart?
Oh, there were targets, flag-type targets that would be pulled by a B-29 or something like that. Then they had what was called, it was a Delmar target. It was just a big bomb-shaped thing that was towed. And
Is that spelled D-E-L-M-A-R?
what?
D-E-L-M-A-R? Delmar?
Delmar, same as the racetrack.
I was just reading about the X-15 and they kept mentioning Delmar this and Delmar that. I had no idea what they were talking about, and I still don't.
But
Well, anyway, whatever. Okay, so you guys didn't go out and do any dogfighting with when you had F-86s up together?
well, we do that, but not as part of our true mission, which was mainly to shoot down on a 90-degree pass.
No, actually, let's go back to the F-80 a little bit. I forgot to talk about this. Actually, you were in a squadron with Robin Olds, correct?
That was no, I was not. I was in the, Robin Olds was the commander of the fighter wing at Ubon.
Oh, well, this is much later then. Okay.
Yeah, that was in the
In
Vietnam
60s.
War.
Yeah, Vietnam War. Okay.
Now, I worked for General Olds at Norton Air Force Base when I was a lieutenant colonel by then.
Yeah. Okay, so progressing along, so we're going to the F-86. So how long did you fly the F-86?
Well, when I left Itazuki, I got stationed at Tyndall Air Force Base, and they had 86Ds there, and it was still a transition base where they would get people and transition them into the F-86D. And so I flew the 86D at Tyndall Air Force Base.
You must have been an instructor there.
Pardon?
Were you an instructor there?
Yes, I was an instructor there.
Okay.
And then we transitioned into the F-102.
So the F-102, you must have been one of the very first squadrons in a 102.
Not really. Well, pretty close, yeah, because we were the training center for the 102. Now, some squadrons transitioned on their own, back at their own base, but we were sort of the pipeline for F-102 pilots.
How about, so compare the 102 to the F-86. I mean, these are two completely different airplanes.
Well, the F-102 was probably, to my opinion, the best airframe I ever flew, because it was a remarkable airplane. It could turn on a dime, because that huge wing area, you just put it in the bank yank, and boy, you just swap. An interesting thing, at one of our Armed Forces Day air shows at the base, we gave a demonstration of the turning capability of the 102 the pilot did a figure 8 within the airfield boundary in the 102. He was about 50 feet off the ground. He was an afterburner all the way, just honking that thing around, and a figure eight inside the field boundary, and it was an 8,000-foot landing strip. So that was really a good demonstration of how that thing turned.
Now,
We used to do some dogfighting, not part of our training program, but you know, a couple of guys would get together and do this, and we could split S from 5,000 feet.
Oh,
You just suck that thing around.
so the now this is also completely radar controlled airplane by a ground controller.
Mm-hmm.
So you would launch on a mission, attack the target, and was this when they started using the term Fox 1 and Fox 2?
The what?
Well, you had missiles. You had
Yeah, the F-102 had missiles and rockets. It had 6 Hughes, what did I call them? They were both radar and optical controlled rockets. In other words, you would lock onto your target, and at launch time, the rocket would come out of the belly and lock on to the target and launch.
Was it AIM 9 or something like that?
Not AIM 9, AIM 12. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. Right. So what was the typical pattern to if you were been engaging another aircraft? I mean, it's coming towards you.
Well, with these missiles, you could do a head-on. In other words, target coming in, do a head-on and launch the missile and hit the target, or on a stern, or at any particular angle, actually.
But
Because the missile was controllable.
So when you fired the missile, what was your indication to the controller that you fired the missile?
The ground controller would not know.
No, but when you pulled the trigger and you fired the missile, what did it say? Fox 1, Fox 2?
Mission accomplished.
Oh, okay, all right. I just
MA is a
yeah,
mission accomplished.
yeah, right. Well, I'm just thinking in the F4 we did that, and we did air intercept it. I was in Europe, and that's what a lot of we did. Is when we'd sit alert, and did do your beam attack, and you'd launch your Sparrow, and you'd say Fox 1, and then you angle around and get in the back of the guy.
We didn't use that term.
Really? Wow. Huh. I thought those were old terms.
But the F-102 was a great airplane.
How many hours did you end up getting in it?
Well, probably maybe 1,000, 1,500.
So,
Because after Tyndall, I was transferred up to Goose Bay, Labrador, and we had F-102s up there.
and did you ever intercept any Russians?
A lot.
A lot. And then when you did, it was the same thing?
Because what they would do is they would come in and fly outside of the, whatever the boundary was, 200 miles? And just parallel the coast, going south, and we would go up and take a look at them. And
Did you guys wave at each other and all that sort
we
of?
wouldn't get that close.
Really?
Because you don't want to interfere with their flight path or anything, and you certainly don't want to get close enough to get shot down.
Did you ever have anything unusual ever happen specifically in the 102 that you remember?
Oh. Actually, I really never had any problems with the 102. It was a very one time I had the control system got some air in it or something, and I was violently rocking the wings. But when I slowed down, it was just a very slow one, and then I went into land. It was okay, but that was the only real incident. And initially it was a little scary because your head was being banged against the canopy.
Yeah. And so what was no, it was a supersonic airplane.
It was a Mach 1.2 airplane.
And did you ever get it going Mach 1.2?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And actually, the F-102 was the very first military aircraft that used the area rule in their design. That's where the Coke bottle shape of the fuselage.
Right. Okay, so now you've flown the 102 from what years do you recall?
Probably 58, 59, until I left Goose Bay at 61 or something on that order. And then after that, I was assigned to a SAGE headquarters. SAGE was semi-automatic ground environment or something or other. And I was a staff officer there, and I was assigned to a fighter unit down at Castle Air Force Base.
Okay, so you were actually in the cockpit from 52 to like 61 or so, and now you get essentially a ground pounder organization.
No, I was still flying.
What are you flying then?
They were 106.
Oh boy. Where did you train for the 106?
At the SAGE headquarters building was at Beale Air Force Base. And I was assigned for flying down at Castle Air Force Base. So I would get a T-33, fly down to Castle, and I'd pull alert and get the 20 hours a month in the F-106.
Oh my God.
It was part of your job.
It sounds like a dream job to me.
Oh, it was. It was. And the 106 was a great airplane, but it was not as, it was a heavier airplane. It was a much faster airplane. I had it up at about 2.2, a Mach 2.2.
Really? Okay, now the 102, did you wear a G suit in the 102?
No.
G meter?
Hmm?
There was no G meter either, was there?
There was a G meter, yeah.
Really? Okay.
But the mission of the 102 was such that you didn't pull a lot of Gs.
As I was telling you before, when I was at Hahn Air Base in Germany, the 496 Fighter Interceptor Squadron was there. And one of the guys, there was a bunch of guys that weren't married, so we would all hang out at the bar at night. And one night, this guy named Bill McDaniel came in, and he was ticked off because he'd just gotten chewed up by an F-4 in some aerial combat, over northern Germany someplace. And he threw his hat down on the table. He said, "I've had it, you bastards." He says, I gotta learn how to fly air combat. So he borrowed our 3-1 air combat manual, and him and another guy went down to Torrejon for 2 weeks, and they did nothing but fly combat between each other. When they got back, they kicked our ass all the time.
Oh yeah, it was a turning machine.
And the worst part was he'd just stay up high. He wouldn't come down low because he knew we had the performance ability with the F4 down low, but up the top. I mean, I was in a flight once where we had agreed to meet, and there was something they called a stargazer frequency, 364.2. I have no idea what that is, but we'd just say go stargazer or something like that. And so we'd meet, and then in a flight of 4 against one F-102, he tracked 3 of us. I mean, he just kicked our butt.
I had F-102. I was on a cross-country flight, and to get past some thunderstorms, I flew the 102 at 55,000 feet.
Whoa!
And it was just as solid as a rock up there.
And I think, what's the highest you think you ever got an F4? About 33,000 or 35,000, something like that? I mean,
I'm not sure. I really never tried getting the F4 at a high, but the F-102 would climb up to 55,000 feet.
Yeah, I think the F4, we would, cross countries in 35,000, 36,000. I tried.
When I was on this cross-country flight, going to 55,000 feet to get past these thunderstorms, I passed one that I was looking up at the top.
Where were you going at the time, do you remember?
What do you mean?
I mean, from where to where? Where were you?
Well, from Ellington at Houston, Texas, and I was heading back to Tyndall.
Yeah, good old Texas and thunderstorms.
Mhm.
Oh, boy. Okay, so you flew, so you transitioned into 106. What was the difference in the, besides it felt heavier, what was any other differences? I mean, would it turn as well?
Did not turn as well, but that wasn't the mission of the 106. The mission of the 106 was to go out and shoot missiles. And
Did you have radar guided and heat seeker missiles?
in the 106, yeah, you had radar, the Hughes, the Falcon, that was the
There you
name.
go, Falcon.
The Hughes Falcon.
And there were the doors that would open up to
Yeah,
drop the
doors
missile.
would open up and a rack would lower the missile and it would shoot.
Did you ever fire the missile in either the 102 or the 106? Ever actually fire?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, with the 102, I shot down a Firebee.
Oh, you did? Where was that?
Well, I was a member of the team, actually I was the project officer for the William Tell team when I was up at Goose Bay, Labrador. This was 1961.
Okay, this is really a big deal that I think myself and one other person noticed your shirt that said William Tell on it. Gordon, he noticed it too when you wore it one day in here. Tell us about William Tell.
Well, I was the project officer for the William Tell team from Goose Bay, Labrador, and did an interesting thing. The target, the Firebee, Ryan Firebee, they were used at Tyndall Air Force Base as targets. So what I did is I took a cross-country trip down to talk to the people that knew all about the Firebee, and they told me exactly where the strongest return was on the Firebee. It wasn't dead astern, or it wasn't dead 90 degrees. It was about maybe 30 degrees off of dead astern, and so we built our whole tactics on having the radar observer on the ground position us at that point, because that was the strongest return. And we did something different when on the flight that I shot down a Firebee. The standard procedure for very high altitude fast targets was to do a head-on, because if you got behind and got too far behind, you were lost. But we decided that even though that was a standard procedure, it wasn't the best, because the best return on it was 30 degrees off the tail.
How many William Tell events were there? Do you recall? Do you know?
Well, you mean in 1961?
Well, no, they did it for a period of years.
Oh, I think the first one was probably 58 or so, maybe 59, 50, 57.
And when did they stop doing it?
I don't know. I think they still do it.
Oh, really? Really? Okay, so by the way, did your team win that year?
Well, we not only won, but we won with a perfect score, because every one of our targets, we scored an Area 1 hit, because we were in that perfect position.
So now the missile they fired, as I recall, the missile actually does itself at a 102 you were flying that time?
From 102.
When you fired the missile, what did it do? Could you feel it in the airplane?
Well, you would hear and feel sort of a vibration when the bomb bay or the missile bay doors would open and the missile got extended into the airstream. You'd feel that burble. but that's about all. But the reason the Goose Bay team came out with a perfect score was, two, because of the tactics we used, but also I remember at the end of the day on the flight line, all the rest of the squadrons, their airplanes were all buttoned up and the guys were up at the bar. Our guys were still out there fine-tuning the electronics.
So what year was that? 61?
61.
Okay, so now we've moved forward in time, and now you're at Castle and Beale, going back and forth. Somewhere in that time period, now you switched airplanes again. You never flew the 101, did you?
Yes, I flew the 101.
Okay, is that where you flew the 101?
Well, I flew the, after I transitioned into the 106, about 6 months later, the headquarters that I was in was deactivated. So then I moved over to Hamilton Air Force Base, where they had the F-101. And so I transitioned into the F-101 at Hamilton.
Now that was a real step downward, isn't it, from 106, wouldn't you think?
I thought the F-101 was a terrible airplane.
Oh.
It was fast. I think it was about Mach 1.5 airplane. But aerodynamically, it was a disaster.
The high tail being the
Had
principal
high
fault.
tail and high wing loading. The wing loading on the 101 was about the same as the X-15.
Without the velocity.
Single engine, final approach speed, with the high, say right after takeoff, you're full fuel load, and you have to make a go in and land. Single engine. The final approach speed was 220 knots.
Oh my God.
About the same as the X-15.
Well, that's just asking for blown tires on landing, isn't it?
Oh God. Well, while I was at Hamilton, we never had to do that, but that was when you train for a final approach speed of 220 knots.
So you flew out of Hamilton.
Yeah.
What years was that?
Oh, 63, I think, is when I got there. About, I think, 63. And I left there at 68.
Wow, what a place to be stationed.
Yeah.
Did you just think you died and went to heaven being stationed there, didn't you?
Well, the worst part of being at Hamilton Air Force Base is knowing that you're going to be transferred away from there someday. You know, 20 minutes from San Francisco, how could you beat it?
All right, where are we now? Let's see, 1968. Now we're getting into the time period where ADC is kind of disappearing, isn't it?
Well, let me tell you a little more about the 101. When I transitioned into the 101, getting back to the 101,
Okay, tell me about the 101.
well, with the F-102 at 45,000 feet, you could put it in a 30-degree, 40-degree bank and pull it around, but no burble or any problems like that. On my first flight on the F-101, we took off afterburner all the way up to 35,000 feet, solid as could be. At 35,000 feet, came out of afterburner, and I was going to put it into a 30-degree bank. At 20 degrees, I was bubbling.
The F4 was like that too. You know, it had the same sort of, I mean, the F4 Phantom is basically an F-101 Voodoo improved.
But it didn't have the high
Right.
horizontal stabilizer. And that was the difference.
What was it?
A test pilot got killed in the 101 because at Eglin Air Force Base. He took off and he was going to sort of do some flat hatting, took off and pulled it into a sharp climb, and it swapped ends.
Okay, so what was it about the tail that made it so dangerous?
Well, what happened is when you're pulling G's, the air over the wing would be vectored up and then back down, and it would hit the vertical stabilizer on the thing and cause it to swap ends.
Wow.
And there was very little chance of recovering. They actually put the drag chute on so that when you're in this uncontrollable thing, that the drag chute would perhaps stabilize it so that you could pull out. And it didn't always work. It was an aerodynamic disaster.
So now, what were you had backseaters in those airplanes? So what was the backseater? What was their title?
The backseater was a radar observer.
Okay.
Although they did have controls in the back seat.
Also known as Gib, guy in back.
Yeah, guy in back, Gib.
So, okay, so now you're flying the F-101 Voodoo, and where were you flying at?
At Hamilton Air Force
Hamilton,
Base.
right. Okay, so somewhere around 1968, ADC is unwinding, and someone must have discovered we have this.
Well, actually, the Viet Nam War was on.
Right.
And so the Air Force policy at the time was they tried at their best not to have a guy go back for a second tour until everybody had one tour.
Right.
So I got put into the pipeline for the F4, and I went to George Air Force Base for F4 transition.
What year was that?
Probably, actually I got there on the day after Christmas, 47. And I finished up my jet transition, my F4 transition.
67.
Yeah, 67.
Not 47.
Yeah.
Okay, after Christmas in 1967, I was just trying to think of, that's when I was at Hunt Air Base. So, so you flew C models in
Well,
transition.
at George Air Force Base, they had C models and D models. And, well, C's and D's are all they had.
Not much difference, but
Avionics were better on the D model. But the F4 is a good airplane. There was a world of difference between the F4 and the F-101.
they made 5,000 of them. There must have been something I liked about them. So.
Yeah, well, the Navy originally had the F4, and the Air Force saw that it was such a good airplane that the Air Force bought them.
Well, I understood they kind of sold it on the idea that things are so complicated now, you need two pilots. So they wanted to put two pilots in the F4.
Well, that was actually, I think the Navy idea was to have a pilot and a Gib.
Well, they did, but there was no stick in the back seat. And the Air Force said, we'll have two pilots that way.
Yeah.
Months later, something like that.
About 6 months later, yeah.
And you probably had to go to winter survival school.
I went to winter survival school from Hamilton. Actually, when I was being transferred, they first assigned me to winter survival school up in
Instead.
Washington.
Fairchild.
Yeah. And
Wait, what month were you there in the survival school?
actually, when I was there, it wasn't. I don't think it was called it was called survival school.
Right, yeah.
because going to Vietnam, they didn't worry about winter.
Yeah.
But it was more of the business where they stick you into a box and try to break you down and all that sort of stuff.
Finished from George, and now,
I was assigned to Ubon
okay, and what do
in
you?
Thailand.
Okay, and what was the time period of that?
68. I
So
got
let's
there.
let's back up to training. Okay, so you've been flying air defense airplanes, what, 16 years?
Mhm.
Okay. And now suddenly you're gonna be aiming your pink body at the ground doing, what'd you think of that?
Well, it was a whole different way, but we did that actually not as our mission in ADC, but everybody liked to do that sort of thing anyway. So
Well, but I mean, I'm talking about the dropping the 45-degree dive bomb and stuff like that. That must have been.
no, it was just like a roller coaster, you know. Just
But it was just. It must have been quite a
it was
shock. So
it
now
was
you're wearing a G-suit
different.
and
It was different, certainly.
Now, who was the? Were you there at the same time as Robin Olds at?
I got there when Colonel Petrillo was the base commander or wing commander, and I think he succeeded Robin Olds.
So you were after the great Operation Bolo, or what it was called.
Yeah.
It was. So,
Rolling Thunder, I think it was called.
well, Bolo was when they disguised the F-4s as F-105s, and so that brought the MiGs out, and then they turned out to be F-4s instead, and I think they got 5 or 6 airplanes in one day in one flight. 5 or 6 MiGs, I mean.
Now, an interesting thing, I mentioned the 105. After I spent about 6 months at Ubon, I got transferred over to Korat because I was the chief of safety at Ubon.
So you were like a major at this point, right?
I was a major, yes. And they needed a chief of safety that flew the F-4 over at Korat because they were just getting the F-4s. They were getting the F-4E. So they moved me over there because they needed me over there more than at Ubon. But at Korat, we had both the 105s and the F-4. And talking to ground controllers, not the spotters that fly in a small airplane spotting for you.
The FAC.
Yeah.
Forward air control, FAC.
Forward air controllers, yeah. They said that the F-105s were a far better bomber than the F-4 because the F-4, apparently the aerodynamics of it was slinging bombs instead of dropping a bomb in a very nice clean trajectory. And the F-4E got to be better because it was a longer airplane and probably less the wobbly type thing. So the F-4E was more accurate than the F-4D.
And it probably had a better gun too, more consistent.
And it had a machine gun built in.
Yeah.
The D model, you would mount a machine gun underneath in a pod.
And it wasn't always exactly well aimed either.
No, it wouldn't be as well aimed, that's right.
Yeah.
Whereas the F-4E had the machine gun built into the...
So, let's take a break here while I change tape.
I need to grab some lunch, just